Hey, this is Tim bringing you words of grace today from the front of one of the corporate giants in America. Of course, that's Chia Pets. No, not at all. That wouldn't be American. Actually, the GE building. And I've come here to talk about giants and David and Goliath specifically. Just reading through life of David in my devotions, wanted to share some words of grace to you from his life today. Many of you probably woke up to the fact that your March Madness bracket is totally awash, totally busted because of the number 16 seed taking out the number 1 seed, right? UMBC defeated UVA, and first time ever in NCAA men's basketball tournament history, the number 16 seed took out the number, and took them out handily, right, by 20 points. Virginia is not the typical Goliath of Gath, though. They don't run people over and laugh in their face. All these NBA scout, NBA kids. No, they're just a solid team. So, in one sense, we can kind of understand it. But it's still fascinating that the number 16 seed beat the number 1 seed. This is the David and Goliath. David and Goliath is the ultimate underdog story. But if you understand it correctly, it actually isn't, because Goliath was the underdog. Now, why would I say that? I say that because David put himself on God's side, and he knew that God was behind him. And if God was behind him, then no one was against him, right? First of all, David was aligning himself with God's purposes. He was passionate about God's glory, right? If you put yourself toward the way God is going, then all those who are opposing to God is going to oppose. And so you put yourself on God's side. And you see that from David's life, from his psalms, his poetry. He glorified God. And really his passion with Goliath was, he was so concerned about God's glory and that this Goliath giant was defying Israel. And so he stood up to him. And so we find in David someone who is passionate about God's passion. And we need to do that in life as well. Whether we eat or drink or whatever we do, if we do it for God's passion, for God's glory, we know He's behind us. He's working on our side, and those who are opposing God are opposing us. So be passionate about God's passions. Also, he was faithful, right? You think of David as a faithful servant, whether that be with the little sheep, his father's sheep, taking cheeses to his brothers. He was asked to do, he did well. God uses faithful people who are passionate for His glory. Also, I see in him his connection to Christ in an unusual way. He understood his forgiveness was through God, and we find Jesus as the ultimate Messiah who would be the sacrifice as the basis for David's forgiveness. But we find in him not a passionate desire to wipe out his sins by his own works, but to accept God's forgiveness based on His promises. That's the only way to be accepted before God, is based on Jesus the Messiah. The one primary I wanted to leave with you today is the words of grace. Come from that 1 Peter, also from Proverbs. God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. If you want God working on your behalf as a believer today, then you need to be sure that you're humbly submitting to God's hand. David referred to him so often as the servant of God. As he talked to Saul there in that story, he was saying, I'm your servant. As he went to take on Goliath, his passion was not that he was pointing to his gifts and his abilities, but he's like, God can do this. Just like God gave me victory here, God can do this. It wasn't based on his strength or any gifts of his own. He was relying on God. And that sweet, humble spirit is what God gets behind. So today, be passionate about God's glory based upon the sacrifice of Christ. Come boldly before His presence and humbly kneel and say, Lord, what do you want me to do? Right? Is there not a cause that I can step up to for your glory? Humbly take His grace. God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble.